Hello everyone, this is the fourth of the 5 video series on farmers' protests. In this video, we will describe what is the situation of the farmers' protests as of December 16, 2020. This is a fast evolving protest, so please stay tuned with the Kisan Ekta Morcha YouTube channel for latest updates.
Now you've heard what's happening, what the issue is. So let's look at what it's resulted in. Farmers all over India have come together in the Kisan Majdoor Ekta Andolan, which is basically a farmers and laborers' united effort to make their situation better, or at least not let it get worse. It's a diverse movement with people from all over India, including the states of Bihar, Rajasthan, Haryana, and Punjab. And there are 400 to 500 farmer unions from all over India who are supporting this cause. There are also transport unions, which are representing over 14 million truck drivers who are also participating. This has led to 200,000 to 300,000 farmers to converge to Delhi borders. It started as a protest within states, particularly in Punjab. There were sit-ins and such, and when the prime minister didn't acknowledge their protests, it resulted in a Delhi Chalo movement. And now 250 million people did a strike on November 26, 2020. And in the days following that, it resulted in police violence. So this is not just a Sikh or a Punjabi movement. It is a peaceful protest being put on by people from all different religious communities. We can see in this picture, there's Muslim communities providing food to protesters. In this picture in the middle of the screen, we can see that there are people who are very obviously Sikh and people that are very obviously Muslim, and the remainder who may be Hindu. And this has resulted in gender norms changing a little bit. With more men at protests, women are having to take over farming duties that typically men would have done. So can we move on to the next slide? So this mass movement that's affecting everyone in farming states has had a very strange response from the government and the media of India. So there's been major suppression of the protests. There's been use of police force through water cannons and also tear gas and lathi charges, which is basically, for those of you who don't know, beating protesters with sticks. And to discourage more people and supplies arriving at the protest site to support the protest, so like food, hygiene materials, things to occupy their time. People were sending tractors and trolleys full of supplies to the protesters, and to discourage this, the government actually went through and ripped up roads, which is not just a horrible thing to do for the lack of protests, but also economically, it is devastating for India. And there's also been a lot of propagandizing from the government and the media that supports the government. Cabinet members are portraying this protest as misled and misinformed, and they're being given a platform on media sites that protesters aren't necessarily talking to. Protesters are putting out their own form of media. They recently came out with a newspaper of their own. They are putting out what's going on at the protests through their personal social medias, but they're not talking to mainstream media platforms and newspapers and such. So ministers are being given a platform on the mainstream media sites to further their misled and misinformed idea. In fact, the Union Cabinet Minister of Agriculture actually said that this protest is an exception and limited to one state. But we can see that it is definitely not limited to one state, and it is not an exception. Most farmers are involved in this protest. Next slide, Chuck. So as far as media coverage goes all over the world, in India, there's a lot of misinformation. There's this push that this is actually a secessionist movement, a Khalistani movement. The protesters are anti-nationals, and that these protesters are actually hired or bribed to protest, that they're not actually protesting. It's just to make the situation look worse and make the government look bad, which is, again, not the case. We're seeing through personal social medias and things like that. In the European media, it's mostly only being covered by BBC and mostly only by people of Indian heritage, which shows again that the European Union is not taking these protests seriously. In the US media, it's not being reported much, and when it is, it's being reported in op-ed style rather than in the straight news section. There's not, and all these op-eds are also being written by people of Indian heritage. And the reason we have an issue with this is because we don't need the Western world to take a stance on the issue. We need the Western world to take notice of the issue, because we need to protect these protesters from further police violence. India has a history of human rights violations, and through media coverage, we can ensure these violations don't happen. But if Western media doesn't cover it, the Indian government doesn't necessarily know that the Western world is taking notice of what they're doing. So next slide. And there are prominent educated people who have come out in support of these protests. Sukhpal Singh, who's a professor and former chairperson of the Center for Management in Agriculture, is saying that investments don't come due to a change in law, but due to incentives. So again, he's saying that forcing the agriculture market into a free market isn't going to make more investments in the industry. It's not going to make companies support small farmers. They need an incentive to do so. Otherwise, they will economically exploit these farmers. And Kashif Basu, a former chief economist of the World Bank, is also a professor of economics at Cornell. So again, another very qualified person, has studied the new farm bills and has called them flawed and says that they will be detrimental to farmers, and that the agriculture regulation needs to change, which farmers agree it does need to change, but these new laws will not help the farmers.